So we left off with 1.3. We saw the video. We will be making the video available after the conference. I know it was hard to read, so you can go through and watch it at your leisure. First I have to edit it and put the forward-looking statements and all that fun stuff at the beginning, just so we're all on the same page that what you saw is a prototype and not necessarily what you're going to get delivered to you. So we were talking about 1.3. Basically, the big thing with 1.3 is the JSON web token is used to pass the information. So rather than getting the URL encoded form parameters, you'll get an actual JSON web token that contains all the launch parameters and all the security stuff. What you may be wondering, how does Blackboard support 1.3? As you may have guessed, it is coming soon. So we have not yet developed it. I don't think we have issued a line in the sand on when we will make it available, but it is coming soon, and a lot of the code's being worked on. So I suspect we will have it for you as soon as we can.
So I realize this is probably super forward-looking, but is the end goal that all LTI registrations would go through a portal like that?
It's a function of how 1.3 works, because basically it's based on public and private keys, and so we have to have a way to input that private key without having to pass that along to every client. And so everyone, every partner or developer that uses 1.3 will have to go through the portal eventually. But that said, if you're using 1.1 or 1.0, that'll still go through Learn as you would expect it today.
Yeah, on the longer term, we're looking to sort of simplify some of those processes or make adoption easier. So you can imagine that there becomes a sort of an adoption workflow on the flip side of that, right? Where you're looking to adopt a particular third-party tool. It's fairly common. You don't have to go and get the key, string key. You should be able to just discover in a catalog and adopt and kind of simplify that workflow. So there will be other pieces and components coming on around that over time. But right now, our goal is to be able to be demonstrable with all of LTI Advantage, including 1.3 plus those services at there's an IMS Tech Congress in November. So that's kind of what we're driving toward, is being able to be fully demonstrated at that point in time.
Any other questions about that? All right, in that case, let's talk a little bit about LTI Advantage. To me, LTI Advantage is sort of a fancy term that means we have these services that are built to work with LTI, and so we're going to package them together under one term so that it's easy to remember and you think about it. Really, right now there's 3 services involved. Deep linking, which if you've been around LTI a while, you may know as content item message. And we also have names and roles, which is formerly known as the membership service. And then the new one, I think, is assignment and grades, which is, we talked a bit about LTI 1.1 and the outcome service and how sort of basic it is. Assignment and roles gives you a little bit more power around what you can actually do through the LTI connection. So, is that blurry? There we go. It's a little bit of lag, so apologies as I hit the button. It'll take a few seconds for everybody to see the new slide. But essentially, deep linking is, as I mentioned, formerly known as content item message. And basically, in Learn terms, you can think of it sort of like a mashup. And so when you create a content item message LTI link, it shows up in the build menu for the instructor. They click build, they click the link to the content item message service, and it's one launch out into a third-party tool. And the idea being, much like a mashup, you get out into the third-party tool and you select the items that you want to include in your course. And there's one pushback, and the content items are automatically created with the LTI links specifically to the items that you've selected. Of course, it's an LTI tool outside of Learn, so implementation is up to the provider. I know I've seen some demos, the Sugi tool, for instance, which implements this, but you can only push one content item back at a time. And so It's really up to the folks who implement it on exactly how much feature and functionality you get with it, but that's the idea, is that you can click one link, select the things that you want, and push them all back at once.
Do you, maybe Wade can answer this question. Do you know if there's any, is there any planned support for linking within that content back out to the LTI system? So, one example is with video content. If you want authorized access to video content on an external server, you need to embed that with an appropriate token. Is there any plan to be able to do that? To have LTI links embedded within content somehow?
So you mean like along the lines of a mashup where it would be embedded into the content editor? Is that what you're thinking? So you would push back like a content item that had the link in the description?
Yeah, so if it was like a YouTube, or if YouTube supported LTI, then, and you had some collection in YouTube that also required authorization to access, so you've got a mashup to embed that content into your LMS, and that mashup for choosing the content uses LTI for authentication and authorization. And then once the content is in there, you've got the embed code in your content in the LMS. But when somebody clicks on that, you need some way to authorize them, authenticate and authorize when they go back out to YouTube or the YouTube-like system. And getting that link, that embedded link, to be LTI compatible is the question.
So currently, when you push back the content item message or the deep linking, all you're really pushing back is LTI links. And so basically, all you get is an LTI link. So you click that LTI link and LTI assumes trusted pass-through. So I don't know how that would be accomplished within the spec. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Wade, but.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through that too. So let's say you're in Learn, you have an LTI launch into some sort of video playing service, and then in the video itself, it has its own LTI launch to another third tool.
Oh,
in this case, or
it might still be the video tool or a part of the video tool, but it's separate to the choosing of the video to embed.
right.
It's something that the student interact with. Maybe it's something we can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, just take apart the use case and try to figure out. I mean, my initial reaction is if that other tool itself supports LTI launches and can understand its same context for the second launch, I would think so. But where you might run into issues is you do still need to have this, shared key secret between where you're launching from and where you're going to. So we couldn't necessarily expect that the second tool that you're in, if the first one's the one that was registered, would be able to then launch to the third tool if it in and of itself doesn't have a trusted connection. And I don't know that that's a use case we've talked about yet in the working group. But maybe it's an interesting use case for coming back around to this registration and re-registration set of services. So yeah, let's definitely chat about that.
All right, so the next service is the names and roles provisioning service, much more easily referred to as memberships. And essentially what this is when you launch from within a course, you have the ability to pass through a URL where you can request the memberships for that course. Certainly can come in handy. I wish we had implemented it when Mark and I did the sign-up list tool, because it would have been a lot easier than making a few REST calls to get the full information from the course roster that we needed if it was just a single endpoint that I could have called. But at the same time, it is pretty useful. It's been a use case that's been around for a long time. It's nice that we can meet that through the form of LTI in a standard way. And the new one is assignment and grades. And so we had, again, we had talked a little bit about LTI 1.1 and essentially how that it's just a simple pass-through of a 0.0 to a 1.0. With assignment and grades, you have a lot more power at your fingertips. Basically, you can, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can create columns in the gradebook that allow you to pass through the grades, even if it's not associated with an LTI link. You can have basically a wider variety of scores that can be passed back, so you can pass through an 87 as opposed to a 0.87. You can also pass back assessors' comments, so if the instructor goes through the grading process in the third-party tool, they can actually pass back the comments based on the grading that they've done, so you can capture that within the gradebook. And then you can also batch this, so you can send back multiple requests in a single pass-through, which is a big, I think, improvement over the 1.1 spec. And also the instructor can override history of grades. So again, just a lot more power that you get within the context of an LTI tool passing grades back into the LTI tool consumer. So how does Blackboard support this? Well, we've already supported deep linking since Q4 2017. Names and roles we added in Q2 2018. And we expect assignment and grades in Q4 2018. Forward-looking statements apply unless Wade is going to correct me.
No, we're going to miss it.
Oh.
It'll be the following release.
Okay. So we're looking at Q2 2019.
Yeah.
But still coming soon. I think a lot of work involved in that particular spec. So.
Once we got into it, it was more complex than we originally thought.
So this is what deep linking looks like in the context of Learn. Essentially, it's still called content item message in the user interface, but when you manage your placements, you have the ability to set a content item message placement. Yes?
Sorry, this is really related to the screen, but not to the content item message. The placement allows grading is moved in Q2 2018. It's under build content, before it was under assessments.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, have we changed? Is that something that was supposed to happen, or?
Yeah, so there's been some normalization going on between original experience and ultra experience, and having it so that a single configuration applies in the exact same way across both user experiences. So that's included being able to support things like an administration tool, that a course tool can be defined and made available to different user roles. So this is an instructor-only tool. This is available for both instructors and students. Where we had between the two user experiences, a pretty significant gap is around the contextualization of what the tool is or what category it lives in. So we pared that back so that it's consistent between both, and so there was a change there around the concept of assessment. And that's where that change came from.
Two parts of the menus for us.
So you're seeing...
Well, we've got like assessments in assessments, and then we've got the content as well now. New LTI ones, they're heading to the build content area when you place the collapse rating. It doesn't put them under assessments anymore. Sorry, this is an aside, but it's just like...
Yeah, in terms of the location.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's follow up on it and take a look at how we can... I mean, the change was by design. It was to normalize across both user experiences, but maybe there's still an opportunity to improve it in some way or make it a little clearer. So we have to follow up.
Sorry for the sound, but yeah, it's just like, oh, that's the screen. That's the thing that does it.
All good? And so names and roles, again, still called memberships. But you can see here in the edit provider domain, allow membership service, yes or no. And both of these are specific in their current iterations to the old LTI 1.0 standard as far as security and those things. As we roll out 1.3, we will then support these in the 1.3 method as well. Are we going to drop support for the 1.0 methods, or do we not care?
At this point, no plans specifically there.
Perfect. And just, oh, yes, sorry.
Just wanted to ask if there are any plans to add role mapping into that interface. We, in the past, as I'm sure many others have heavily used the Ocelot building block LTI, and not being able to map roles, like internal learn roles to certain IMS roles as part of that pass-through has been a bit of a challenge for us. So I just wondered where that was going.
It is planned. Right now, it is the next project related to LTI that we'll do as soon as LTI Advantage is done. So yeah, definitely starting to look at that and general role behavior cleanup more broadly, but then also the mapping.
And so one last thing I wanted to leave you with, some of the placements, if you have been in the past a building block developer, may seem a little confusing, particularly around system tool versus admin tool. And so this is available on the community site, but I also wanted to share it here today. I think the big thing to note is when you add a system tool, the first time I did it, I looked all over the system admin panel. I'm like, what the heck, where is it? So if you map it to a building block link type, it's actually a user tool, so it would show up in the tool panel. If you want it to show up on the administrator page, then you would add the admin tool. As I mentioned, all of this is available on the community site. If you go to the developer section, there's a standard site, and on the standard space, you'll find the documentation we have on Caliper and as well as LTI. And with the proliferation of 1.3 and Advantage, we'll be hitting that section pretty hard to add new documentation over the coming months. And that is all I have. Any questions before we start on integration migration? All right, cool. I guess while we set that up, do you want to switch computers?
Yeah, can I?
Actually, all you have to do is... Yeah.
Actually, just...
And again, while he's doing that, I meant to mention this before. We actually have an LTI tool provider that is open source that you have access to. It's written in Node.js. So when I originally wrote it, it was 1.0, 1.1, and a little bit of Caliper and a little bit of REST. Eric Preston, who is the lead developer working on the LTI stuff and also who you heard in that video, he has actually been updating it, so it's actually already built as a 1.3 provider. It supports all three of the services from LTI Advantage, but it also supports LTI 2, LTI 1, and LTI 1.1. So if you're looking for some sample code to get started, all you have to do is go to github.com/blackboard and search for the BBDN LTI tool provider. You good?
I think so. We'll find out soon enough, right? So what we're going to talk about now is basically thoughts and considerations behind what it takes to migrate your integrations from legacy frameworks, don't take that too literally, to using the REST APIs. Forward-looking statement, I don't think there's going to be anything earth-shattering, but statement applies as with our previous conversation around that. So at the end of the day, everyone's migration strategy is different. It's going to be different. You have different integrations. They're specific to your institution, right? So your integration strategy would be different from what mine would be, and et cetera, right? But what are the, do you want your computer here? Because I keep wanting to advance the slides using that, and that just doesn't work well. So there really are about 5 things that you have to consider, right? What your long-term goals are with your environment, right? Which leads to understanding your platform, options, right? Are you looking at self-hosted, managed hosted, SaaS, Ultra? Where do you want to land, and basically in what time frame do you want to get there? Need to understand what is available from an API perspective, and then no matter whether you have 3 or 20 integrations, you want to be able to take a look and prioritize those integrations and look at how you would migrate them. And then my favorite line is seizing an opportunity. And I'll tell a little story when we get to this. But at the end of the day, it's only when you really consider each of these line items are you ready to actually really put together your own specific integration path. So I kind of alluded to the long-term goals, right? And it can be a combination of these things, right? You may not be looking at moving to SaaS anytime in the near future, but you still have the opportunity to migrate from the Java APIs building block model for integrations to using the REST APIs themselves. Where that becomes important, and we'll talk a bit more about it, is when you actually really start talking about moving to SaaS and taking advantage of the Ultra user experiences, right? And so basically, it's all about taking a self-assessment, right? Taking a step back as an organization, as an institution, and really considering what a time frame is and what your future goals are. What do you want to be in the future? And that has short-term as well as long-term impact. So when we talk about platforms, right, we have this 1, 2, 3 conversation that we generally present on. Blackboard Learn is one product. It's delivered with 2 user interfaces. You have the original user experience. That's what you're using if you're on 9.1 self-hosted, for example. And then you have Ultra, and that's an option when you move to the SaaS environment. You can adopt using Ultra. And then there are 3 platforms, right? You have your self-hosted, your managed hosted, and SaaS. It's only on SaaS that you're going to see the benefits of the Ultra user experience. And original experience, and this comes into play as we start to talk and really converse about the use and place of building blocks in your migration strategy. Only the original experience, right, or courses based on the original experience, if you're in SaaS, can take advantage of building blocks, right? When you talk about using building blocks in SaaS Ultra, the only place that you can use those building blocks is if they are behind the system admin panel or are hidden, otherwise hidden in a user experience perspective from faculty and students, et cetera. We'll talk a bit more about that in a few. I mentioned knowing your API options, right? What are the frameworks that are available to you? Today, I'll stand in front of you and say, no, SOAP is not an option. Don't look at it, don't think about it, don't even consider it. We're going to be announcing its deprecation in about 4 months, okay? And that means that it will go into it'll still be supported, but we won't be doing any work on development around it, et cetera. I think I only saw like 1 or 2 hands go up. If you have specific questions about that, please talk with me over the coming days and we'll get a little bit closer on that. Building blocks, right? Those notably, just to make sure we're talking the same thing, Blackboard Java APIs, okay? Some folks talk about REST integrations being building blocks because they call all integrations building blocks. But when I talk about building blocks, I'm speaking very specifically to the Java APIs and what you can build with those. As I previously noted, they work perfectly fine for self-hosted, and as long as you're not in an Ultra user experience, you're fine, okay? When you start talking about using them in a SaaS environment, okay, there's some additional overhead because unlike in a self-hosted environment, you need to work with support to install and manage the building blocks. There's not a B2 integration management panel where you can upload your own building blocks, for example, right? So when you create a new building block or update one, et cetera, you have to go through support, and then they handle that side of the management for you. You can enable and disable, I believe, but not upload and install. LTI and REST. We've been talking a good bit about that over the last hour. I am a fan of LTI. It works really well across all of our platforms, right? SaaS, self-hosted, managed hosted. And one of the things that it does exceedingly well is it provides context, right? So one of the problems if you're doing a RESTful application, you have to provide that context from where that integration was launched or accessed at, right? What course is it? Who's the user who clicked that link, et cetera. LTI provides that for you, right? And that was one of the really cool things about working on the sign-up list is there was a whole lot of stuff that we didn't even have to worry about because it was provided for us by LTI, okay? Where I get really excited when I talk about LTI is when I talk about using LTI in context of also using the REST APIs, because now you're stepping into an area where you have access to information and content that isn't otherwise available via LTI. LTI is an emerging spec. It's going through some changes. It's seeing additions, et cetera. But while LTI grows, the REST APIs are available to meet specific needs. And to be quite honest, it may, let Wade smile at this comment, it may come to pass that LTI does not meet the full spectrum of what a learning management requires to provide that tool integration, at which point you'll still be taking advantage of the REST APIs. The REST APIs at the end of the day are your go-forward integration strategy. If you were sitting here today having never written a building block and looking and saying, oh, should I use these Java APIs or should I do the REST, work with REST? I'd be telling you to work with REST because as the Blackboard product portfolio grows and expands and as we add additional services around the products that we have, they will be exposed to you via REST APIs and not via Java APIs, right? And that is because of the diversity of our products. HTTP access, RESTful APIs are the way for us to go to enable offering to you the tools that you need to build your integrations from. So basically, to kind of summarize those last few bits, REST gives you access to data that LTI currently, I say currently, does not make available via the LTI specification. LTI is the easiest and best way to derive launch context, right? What course was your tool launched from, what user clicked that launch point, et cetera. And then Caliper, which we'll be talking about in a little over an hour from now, is really an excellent model for event-driven data, okay? From a forward-looking statement, from an API perspective, I am having conversations with folks around, what are some interesting data or some interesting objects or data objects where event-driven data would be useful outside of what's available from Caliper. And to be quite honest, that's an ever-narrowing set of data. And to be quite honest, by the time I would get around to addressing events on the roadmap, I have a feeling Caliper will probably have it met. So looking forward to the Caliper combination. But ultimately, it's the combination of these three tools, okay, that you have available to you that will enable you to actually architect your integrations. And as the use cases that we are writing the REST APIs around, okay, continue to grow and expand. I expect that in the future, that what is available via the REST APIs and LTI and Caliper will actually exceed what is currently available to you via the Java APIs. So one of the things that came out of the work that Scott and I did around the sign-up list was, you know, folks were like, well, what was your process, right, for building out the, you know, the sign-up list, right? In a nutshell, basically, what we did was we took a look at what the sign-up list did currently, right? What its basic requirements were. From those basic requirements, we took a look at what framework or architecture we wanted to base the application on, right? Scott and I, being in the mood at the time to be entertained by doing something fresh and new, we chose to use the mean stack, which we used Mongo for the database, and we used Angular for the front end and Express for the web server, and Node.js as the development language. Excuse me. I had never worked with Node. Scott had. My database experience was a bit less than what Scott was done, and so I did the back-end work in Node.js and Mongo, and Scott sorted out the Angular bits as his part, and then we kind of mashed it all together. We ended up with the sign-up list. But ultimately, it was about gathering those requirements and taking a look at what framework best met those needs, right, for us at the time, okay? Which gets us to the learn something new. We opted to learn something new. We could have gone with Java and written it in Java, but yeah, kind of been there and done that, right? So let's do something different. Then we talked about deployment services, and this gets a bit to the conversation earlier today. You know, LTI or REST applications require a hosted service to deliver them from. And so in the case of the sign-up list for our testing and demos, et cetera, we chose to use a service called Heroku. It's basically a platform as a service. You very quickly can spin up a Node.js environment, for example, and it pulls code from your GitHub account, and boom, you have a running instance of whatever you built and have put in GitHub. And as I noted earlier, took advantage of actually walking the walk and talking the talk about test-driven development. And so I think that was a great benefit to be able to go through that. And now we're in a position to actually talk with you about what that means. But it's really these 5 steps, right? Requirements, excuse me. Whether or not you need or want to take advantage of LTI. What's the framework going to look like? How are you going to deploy it? And then you basically, rubber hits the road and you write your integration. Oh my gosh, I really did cut that short, didn't I? Yeah, so now I think we bought some time. So are there any questions about that? I know usually there's a whole bevy of supporting slides with like little dots on them and whatnot about, oh, well, this will work in this environment, this won't work in that environment, which I completely kind of skipped in lieu of making sure we had time to actually move forward. But happy to take a few minutes to take any questions. You are like, that was really straightforward, Mark, thank you. All right, shall we jump to our next bit of subject and maybe we'll get back on track, huh? So, okay, so let's basically kind of dive a little bit deeper into what we just introduced, right? I think that, honestly, one of the, and we've kind of danced around this subject a little bit, but at the end of the day, right, there's a bit of a cost to progress, right? There's a bit of a cost to change. And without change, progress is impossible, right? We'd all still be running Blackboard, well, maybe not, Blackboard 6.3 if there were no changes made to the product, right? And, you know, basically, as we look at moving forward, we have to take into consideration the not only the technical bits that are imposed, but also the how these changes affect our institution. In the previous set of slides, I had a line item where that was seize the opportunity, right? Change, or change that's coming at you, gives you an opportunity, right? When I worked at Dartmouth, whenever we would do an upgrade, one of the first things that I would look to see if I could do was get rid of an integration that I had written that I was still supporting, right? And so as you look at moving to SAS, moving to Ultra, or moving to the REST framework, and you do that analysis of your current integrations, seize that opportunity, right? And because, which is more entertaining, right, from a development perspective? Supporting something that you built 5 years ago, or building something new and fresh that really changes the game for your clients, right? For your faculty and students. I vote for the latter, honestly, which is why I always looked for which integrations I could kill off whenever I upgraded, okay? When you start thinking about seizing that opportunity, right, there are actually really two categories or two areas that you can focus that decision making on, right? You can look at it from a design perspective as well as from a development perspective. Okay, so from a design perspective, is the integration even required, right? Perhaps the latest version of Learn performs the function that your integration originally was intended to serve. Perhaps Ultra does, and you're looking at moving to Ultra. There's a candidate to cut that integration from your list, right? But that is all really done through an analysis of your requirements and through an understanding of the data that's required to support your application, right? Where you surface the application and Learn, et cetera. These all come into play, right? And I think that when we start talking about the design considerations, okay, we have a slightly more limited set, right? But yet on the same hand, or on the other hand, because they are sufficiently broad, each line item is sufficiently broad, like choosing the framework, for example, right? Currently, you're stuck with Java. Right, that's kind of it. You write Java, you include it in the as a building block, and you're done. You go home. But there actually there's a bevy of additional frameworks out there that enable you to accomplish similar tasks. Right. I think a definite consideration is the current state of the APIs. This meant a lot more a year ago than it does today. We're continually closing the gap on the use cases that the APIs support, okay? And so the significance of that comes into play when you actually do your requirements gathering, where you want to spend a bit of time with API documentation and ensure that there are no gaps. If you identify gaps, it's worth a call or a chat with us to actually find out whether or not APIs to meet your use cases that currently don't exist, where they're at on the roadmap, and that helps you plan, right? earlier today noted that there are, examples out there that we've produced to give you a leg up, right? And you can leverage those examples moving forward as part of defining your strategy for doing your migrations. Anything you'd like to add, Scott? Nope. Okay. So, this is, if you can't tell, I'm a fan of Dilbert. I actually have a pretty good, I appreciate where the gentleman's coming from. But ultimately, when we look at, I have as the number one checkbox is analyzing your use cases and requirements, right? Maybe that building block extension that you built is no longer required, right? Or if it is required, in order to do a migration and ideally make an improvement on that integration, you need to take a look at what use cases and it was originally built to solve, right? As well as what the its current requirements are, but then also seize that opportunity. Maybe there's an opportunity here to actually take that integration, and because it's been in maintenance mode, right, and you haven't had the opportunity or the ability really to actually add these 3 or 4 additional bits of goodness to it, now you have an opportunity. As you look at refactoring it, you can say, okay, folks don't use this part of it much, let's get rid of that and let's add in this new feature. I like data. Data is my friend, right? Data is your friend. And as you look at how you build out your integration as you're doing this migration, you can take the opportunity to be more selective with the data that you're actually accessing and caching perhaps, right? Remember earlier today, I talked a little bit about efficiencies from a rate limit capacity where you might want to have caching in your application to cache often requested data if you find that you're requesting something more than once, or if you know that you need to request something once but it is a costly operation perhaps, right? Cache that piece of data. Again, an opportunity, right? Since we started doing this, in 2016-ish, I've had the opportunity to chat with many developers and team leaders and managers, etc. And one of the points of conversation that typically comes up is, well, you know what, we'd be able to do a whole lot more if we weren't locked into Java. Well, there you are. You don't have to use Java anymore with the REST APIs as long as the language is HTTP specific or has HTTP capabilities. Excuse me, you can use that language as well. So even if you have PHP developers, you can turn them loose and let them write integrations. Security and logs. You as an application developer want to manage your own logging of what takes place within the context of your application, and you are certainly responsible for the security of your application, right? So as we noted earlier in the best practices session, you really want to sanitize your inputs, make certain that you have appropriate controls over internal application APIs, etc. Okay. So when you're talking about the APIs as they're currently written, right? I think talked a little bit earlier today about the SIS grade or level of REST APIs. Those fall into the fairly easy category. I think when you start working with things like, honestly, with things like the grade book, assignments, attempts, etc., they get a bit more complicated. That should factor into your prioritization of the migrations that you are looking at doing. Make certain that those APIs align, that your requirements have APIs in alignment, right? If you notice that an API is not available to meet a specific requirement that you have, I strongly recommend that you just shoot developers at blackboard.com an email, and we'll get back to you and we'll have a conversation around what your specific requirement is. And determine if your application requires APIs. Of course it requires APIs. That's such a Dilbert manager moment. We'll just move on. There we go. So earlier I had noted that it took something like, 10 hours to basically write a Python application that used, at the time I think it was 36 endpoints. And what we have here, I think real quick, are just, we were going to do sign up list in addition to this, but I don't think this deck has any sign up list stuff in it. Yeah, so do you want to spin that up on your machine? And okay. All right. Well, we'll get there, okay? But basically, yeah, hopefully on the little monitors you can actually read the code a little bit. But the whole idea here is to actually show the simplicity, if you will, of accessing certain objects using the REST APIs. So in the top of this example here, we just have the basic, outline of, rebooting here for a moment, have the pseudocode, if you will, for what a REST request looks like. And then what we have here is, I'm going to say that it's basic, where we've expanded on the use or on the REST code to actually include it in a function that wraps. So you call get courses, and the whole idea is it returns the results from a URL. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, that's not Node.js code, but yet we have it labeled as Node. Is it? I think you did these. You think so? Okay. Maybe not. I don't know. Well, anyway, so what we did was basically, you have an example here of actually making the get course call as it's embedded in the page. And one of the really nice things about the Java APIs is that they not Java APIs, the REST APIs, once you actually understand the pattern, right, that's applicable across all the APIs. Earlier today we were talking about consistency across products and our APIs and how that was a goal that we were working toward. We exercised that very comprehensively, I think, with the Learn REST APIs. So anyway, so basically accessing course, it's just a get course, and basically you want to check your result status, right? If you got back at 200, it was good. Use your course, otherwise grab the error code. And the APIs support, because when you do so this is a collection get because we're not specifying a course, right? So we're basically making a request and we're getting a result set that is against all the courses in the system, right? And you may have 500, you may have 5,000, you may have more, right? And the idea is if you were to sit and wait for the result set to be built up from all of the course data in your system, you could be waiting quite a long time. And so what we have is we have, albeit this is one point where it's inconsistent, we have limits on the amount of objects that will be returned in a result set on collections, okay? And what that means is that if you have, I think it's 100 with courses, and 200 with memberships or with users. But at the end of the day, what it means is that you will get in the result set, you will actually get a pagination URL in the result set. And when that's present, what that informs you of is that there are more results besides the 100, 200 that you have already retrieved, right? So you would take a look at that pagination URL and make a second request using that URL, and each subsequent result set would increment that URL pointer to the next data set. So earlier I mentioned patterns. Hopefully what we'll see here is that this is almost exactly, if not exactly, the same pattern that we had for courses for doing a collection get on users, right? We have just the pseudocode, we have the URL based on the response, parse the results. If there is a next page URL, then rinse and repeat and make the next request based on the next page URL. And if we look at the actual code, which is Node, by the way, we have essentially this exact same block of code, right? Where we get the users, we check the response, do the right thing, and if the response contains that next page, then boom, bump the URL to the next page and get that next set of users. And essentially rinse, repeat until you don't have a next page URL. And then just to drive it home, one more example that does demonstrates with the code the getting course memberships, course users. I think that this is memberships is one group of APIs where instead of using a post for creating a membership, we actually use a patch. Did I remember that correctly, Scott?
Yep.
Yeah, I did.
We use a put instead of
Put, that I said patch, didn't I? Yeah, put. So there we go. But anyway, the same pattern, right? Remember I said the APIs, once you get your head wrapped around the patterns, you can apply them consistently. Definitely the case here. Anything you wanted to add here, Scott? Because this is the last slide. No. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take a bit of a break from PowerPoint land and actually take a look at the code behind the sign up list project, and we'll show an execution, show it running, right? And maybe it makes sense to actually do the demo before we actually jump into the code. That way we know what we're talking about. Okay. So while Scott spins it up, basically the sign-up list was a building block that was originally written by Malcolm Murray and Stephen Vickers Malcolm's from Durham University, and Stephen Vickers, at the time, I believe he was still with Edinburgh. And they basically wrote a software equivalent of the clipboard that hangs on the faculty's door so you could sign up for office hours, right? But the great thing about having a tool is that not only can it serve for office hours, but it can serve for lab hours or studio hours, et cetera, right? So it's very flexible in that capacity. And so what we did was we sat down with Malcolm and we said, so Malcolm, talk to us about what your building block does, right? And we went through, and from that we built up a list of requirements. And from those requirements we built out a data model. And we said, and Malcolm, what do you wish that your building block could do? So he gave us some pointers, and so we added that functionality to the requirements list that meant adjusting the data model. And then the nice thing is then, because Scott was in on those conversations, we were like, okay, Mark, go off and start working on the back end, defining the Mongo database. And Scott went off to start piecing together the Angular, the front end components, right? And so I think now would be a good time. Let's go ahead and talk about how it was installed, where it's running from, and what it looks like.
Okay, sure. So currently this is available in the Blackboard GitHub account, bbdn-signup-list. Eventually we will move it to the Ocelot GitHub repository. We still, as far as we know, nobody's run it in production, so we'd like to do a full beta test with somebody before we promote it to being fully open source and ready to go. So that's the only reason we're waiting. But essentially, there's instructions in the README file. You can download it. You can. There's actually a one-button click to spin it up in Heroku. If you'd like to host it there, or if you'd like to host it in your desktop and just play with it, you can clone the repository and spin it up that way. It does require the components of the mean stack to be running. So you do need a Mongo database. You do need a server that has Node.js and Express installed in order to run it, and then Angular runs in the browser, so that takes care of itself.
And the README page, I think, has pretty explicit instructions for how to run it in the various environments.
Yeah, and the one thing that we don't have currently is like actual user documentation. I figured as part of any beta test, we may decide to tweak things, and so we were kind of waiting to do that and to create the end user documentation. But essentially, it is ready to be tested, so somebody can just download it and spin it up and give it a go. So that's it. Essentially, it is an LTI tool provider, and it is REST enabled. And so in order to set it up in your Blackboard Learn instance, all you have to do is register the REST application, and you have to register the tool provider domain. It is currently 1.0 only, so it's just the trusted launch. There's obviously no grading involved, although we've talked about ways that we could assign, maybe there's 2 lists and you can get a complete if you sign up for the 2 lists that you have to sign up for, or something like that, although it's not been implemented or even designed or thought about particularly well. So in any case, I've already done this on the server. We've already talked about LTI and REST, and so I'm not going to go through the process of registering that in the background. But here I have a placement in my Blackboard Learn course called Sign Up Heroku. And so right now I am an instructor, so if I click this link, I will get the instructor view. I'm curious to see how this shows up in... Not bad, okay. So first thing to point out, everything where it says LTI data and below, it only shows up if you have debug mode turned on. So you don't have to worry about your instructors seeing LTI launch data and that kind of stuff. But the 2 main things that we see here is we have 2 lists for this course. There is a test list here and a test list here. So if I click on it, it will expand and show you the sub list. So basically, in the context of your course, you may have an office hours list. You may have a lab list. You may have 3 or 4 different things that you need people to be able to sign up for. You're able to do that through this user interface. And then each of those can have sub-lists. So basically you can have a office hours list, and then you can have Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the student can go through and decide which one they want to sign up for. It's configurable, but essentially you can show them who's already on the list if you like. And then you assign like maximum value. So if you only want 5 people signed up for each list, you set that when you create it as an instructor, and you can also decide whether or not there's a wait list. The wait list is implemented to be automatic, so if you're the first person on the wait list and somebody drops from the list, it automatically rolls you in. And so all of that's taken care of for you. And so just a quick tour of the user interface. Here we have a plus button. This list is closed because of the date settings that we had. But if it wasn't, I'd be able to click here to add a new group. This generates an LTI link that you as the instructor can then push into the course so that the student knows to click on this LTI link to access this particular set of sign-up lists. You have the ability as an instructor to print out the lists, and if there were members in these lists, you would be able to see that. And actually, let's view members. So you can see here, Scott Student is signed up for this particular list. So this print button will allow you to print out the list, and you can see who's signed up in each available list. You can edit the list if you like, and you can delete the list. So for the sub-list, here we have Group A. We have a few different things. The star button will only show up if you're on a particular version of Learn that supports the group APIs. So an empty star means there's no group. If I click this button, it would launch off into Learn and actually create a group and then assign all of the members below to that group. So you can quickly create groups based on the list if you'd like to do so. For this button, you can click to add a user to the list. So if you're an instructor and you want to manually add one of the users in your course, you can do that. You can email all of the group members. You can export the member list to CSV file, and of course you can edit and delete the list. And then here under Actions, if I wanted to delete this particular user, I could just click the button to delete them. So let's see.
So just a quick question about the adding the users to the group. When you do the initial launch, have you gone and grabbed the users in the background and then cached that locally? Yeah, so you don't have to go and get the entire list every time someone does so on.
Yep, that is correct. The only thing that we store, though, from a personal identifiable information perspective, the only thing we store is the UUID for the user. So when we do populate information about the user, we will go out and pull it. We're not caching that data because we didn't want to have to worry about privacy concerns for something non-essential like a sign-up list, where if it takes an extra second to call out and get the user information, it's okay. So we didn't want to store any personal data from the students, like names and emails and all that fun stuff. Okay, so now I'm the student, and I'll come into my same course here. And so now if I click my test list as the student, it will eventually load my list. So now I only see the version, now I only see the student version. So a lot of the options that I had at the top about view members and things is gone. This is only one list. So the instructor could see all the lists for that course. The student only sees the list associated with the LTI link. And so from here, I'm already in the list, so I can click Unjoin. Otherwise, if there is room in the list and I wanted to join it, there'd be a join button. So pretty simple interface for the student. Normally, again, this would be like office hours, and then there'd be 3 lists to choose from. In this case, the instructors decided to let the students see who's already in the list. So if they want to be in the office hours with their buddies, they can see their buddies are in that one and they can select it. But you can also hide that if you just want them to select based on timing or what have you. And that is pretty much it.
Demo perspective. So I think, so there really, I think, are 3 areas of discussion regarding the code behind. I mean, certainly there are more, but I think there are 3 that we can speak to in the next 6 minutes, right? And one of those is, how long did it take us to build an LTI application, right, that handled the basic parts necessaries behind an LTI launch, right? And in all honesty, I think that was like less than a half hour.
It took longer to download
The library than
the
to-
library than to implement it.
right? So there's a Node.js library for handling LTI launches and LTI-ifying an application, and so it was very fast to actually get that portion set up and configured. The next point I think worth making is that there are two classes, if you will, of APIs at play here, okay? We're using the Learn REST APIs for courses and users, right? But we're also, and memberships, right? Have we done or have you said you were thinking about adding the membership to LTI? You haven't done that yet? Yeah. No, okay. So there are 2 classes, one where we're of APIs. One that actually is using the Blackboard Learn APIs, and then there's a set of sign-up list APIs that are specific to the sign-up list for controlling sign-up list behavior. Angular will make calls to those to determine how to render the UI, things of that ilk, okay? And then there's I think the security around accessing those APIs. You know, earlier I mentioned that we had an aha moment where we realized that we weren't doing that and that we adopted JWT. So there's a bit of a JWT wrapper around the sign-up list APIs themselves, just so that people from the outside world can't just go, oh yeah, hey, there's a service running, and they maybe guessed an API URL, right, and sent it, and boom, they've hacked the sign-up list. So what we did was we wrapped those requests in JWT token for validation, and they're no longer accessible from the outside world. Okay, which it was, I think, very necessary to moving forward. Let's see, what else? While I'm looking, anything you want to? Oh, we could talk a little bit about my favorite subject, the test-driven bits, right? So Node.js actually has a very nice bit of back-end or a testing library called Mocha, and it actually see, now I'm having brain freeze on chai, yes, not coffee, but tea. And it's supported by using chai for handling. I think the easiest way of saying it is for actually taking and handling the how do I want to say it? The use case is what you want to test on. So basically you have, as I point to this screen, which makes no sense to you, so this is essentially a test for just testing whether or not the database is accessible, right? And to use Mocha and Chai, you set up this little block of code here called describe, okay, that you're going to chain together the requests that with callbacks, or you can use promises, right? I've not gotten to the point where I'm comfortable doing that, but you can get to a point where you're actually ending at a result state, and then you basically have a statement that you're checking. So here, basically the Mongoose connection ready state should be, that's the chai part, equal to 1, okay? And it's really awesome because what you can do is can we jump to another one, like maybe course number 2, where you can actually set everything up. When I did this, I had yet to become enamored with mock objects, etc. So I actually am using these hard-coded just data points, right? And as we scroll down, we could look at the JWT claims part, for example, right? Yeah, we're going to have to go further down for the tests. Excuse me. Okay, so there's a lot of setting up, but that's a good spot, right? So I have an expected behavior, right? I expect this particular test to fail, right? And basically what I'm doing is I'm like saying, hey, you know what? I should not be able to access the sign up list post URL if I'm not an instructor, okay? And that information is pulled from the JWT token, okay? Whether or not I am a privileged user based on the LTI launch. So when I launch LTI, I generate the JWT token and I use that forward to validate URL or requests, right? And so the expected behavior is that I should fail. Basically, here's the chai request, right, with the post. And at the end of it all, I expect the response to be an error, right? Boom, that should fail. So when I run my tests, and we could entertain ourselves and maybe run it once and see what happens. Let's see. Yeah, look at that, there we go. And so it's going to churn through, and we had 76 tests, right, that went through this to validate the code. And the really cool thing here is that if you tier together, and I'll be quick because, is T up at 3? Yeah, so I'm going to be quick. Don't want to keep people from their tea, right? Is that you could actually bind all of this together using something like, I want to say grunt, or is it growl? Where you can basically...
I think it's grunt and growl.
I think it is, yeah. Well, anyway, just like you can with Jenkins and Java, right, where you can have a build process that runs through and iterates through and does your tests, you can do the same thing here, right, where you can have a DevOps operation around, you know, these test cases, which is, honestly, I think this is what enabled us to actually deliver it, the beta so quickly, right? I think collectively, for the size of this particular project, combined between the two of us, I'm looking to Scott to see if he'll agree with me. I think altogether, both of our time, we have like maybe 80 hours invested in it. And I rewrote some of the back-end stuff like twice, especially around the database. And I know you redid the front end 3 times, right? So there was a bit of redo because we were learning some new stuff instead of going with something that we knew. We can entertain questions after tea. Yeah?